Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at our penultimate program in the Arizona Histories American Stories program series. I'm Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Manager for the Arizona Historical Society, a staff historian, and an associate editor of the Journal of Arizona History. A little bit about the society before we start our program. AHS is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution and a state agency established in 1864. We collect, preserve, and tell the story of Arizona's past through museum exhibits, libraries and collections, outreach, educational programs, and publishing. AHS preserves our past, shares our state stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona's history. Our members love Arizona history, and support for programming like this comes in part from membership dues. So if this is the kind of programming that's right up your alley, consider becoming a member. Members get free admission to AHS museums, special members only events and members pricing for programs, print copies of the Journal of Arizona History, and so much more. To learn about all of the membership tiers and membership benefits, visit us online at azhs.org. In addition to information about membership, you can find information about all the things that are happening at the Society. You can sign up for our email list, follow us on social media, explore one of our museums, and you can learn about all of that and more by visiting azhs.org today. A couple helpful reminders. So this is a Zoom webinar, which means Jake and I can't see or hear you, which means it's a great opportunity to enjoy your lunch. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature for questions and comments, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. There is one more program left in our series that will be June 10th, bringing us to the second and later part of the 20th century. So we hope that you will join us for that program. In addition to that, I believe it's next week already, we're hosting a trivia night at the Arizona Heritage Center in Tempe. So if you're in the Tempe area, we hope that you'll come out for some trivia. 6 to 8, Friday, May the 29th. Information about how to register in advance is going to be on our calendar on our website. All right, and without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenter for today. Jake Wolff is a PhD candidate at Temple University, where he is writing a political history of the United States that follows the rise and revival of Route 66, also known as the Mother Road. Before going back to school, he was a transportation planner in Albuquerque and also worked for his family's construction business in Pennsylvania. And Jake was a recipient of an AHS research fellowship, and we were so glad to have him in our archives. And I hope that he'll talk a little bit about some of the materials that he's accessed to AHS. Jake, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Janie, and my gratitude to the whole Arizona Historical Society community, not only for hosting, but also for all that you do to advance the humanities throughout the Southwest. Like you said, a summer 2025 fellowship in Tucson. I'm very grateful for that. It was instrumental for me conducting this research for my dissertation. And the first half of the dissertation project will comprise a lot of what I say here today. It is indeed also a privilege to be a part of the Society's series Arizona Histories American Stories in commemoration of USA 250, because the West, as an idea, was central to why English colonists living along the Atlantic coast decided to declare independence from Great Britain. I'm by no stretch a scholar of the Revolution, but plenty of historians have written about this topic from 1776 all the way up through 1912 here in Arizona. Folks like Juliana Barr, Ned Blackhawk Petty, Nelson Limerick, just to name a few, have been instrumental in my thinking about 20th century highways as a government project that achieves those aims of administering a very large continental state. And I think mapping these long-term connections, like this series strives to do, is what history does at its best, allowing us to see beyond episodic struggles and successes and to make sense of what this experiment in democracy, what really holds it together. So, in this talk on paving Route 66 and its kind of intellectual origins from 1893 through 1938, I've organized our journey along or around three key political episodes. Automobile races in 1915 and 1916 that roughly determined the route. This centers on Gallup and Springerville. Some urban rivalries, which resulted in cutting off several small towns after 1925. These cutoffs are part of a struggle or a competition between Albuquerque and Phoenix, really, and an interstate competition later on in the New Deal that ironically resulted in the creation of ports of entry that slowed down movement over state lines during the height of the Dust Bowl crisis. All three of these make for good, entertaining stories in and of themselves, peppered with big personalities and bold rhetoric. Yet, when taken together, our cast of characters who overlap in surprising ways start to show us a pattern. For one, what those road boosters hope to achieve in the emerging automobile age, and two, which is often overlooked in histories of highways, the issues that these highway boosters wanted to banish to the past. You've got to remember that private railroads paralleled and predated almost all these public roads by a half a century and existed too, those railroads, as a dream dating back as early as the US-Mexico War, and were justification in part for why the United States conquered almost half of Mexico. By the 1890s, when the National Good Roads movement got its start, about one-third of all these railroads that the US had strove to build in the 19th century were nearing or in bankruptcy, including the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, which Route 66 parallels almost in its entirety. This is not coincidental. In fact, this is also why it's so fitting that the good folks in Kansas have added a yellow brick stretch where the Mother Road enters into their populous state. This kind of populist politics was popular all across the West in the 1890s when people were starting to think about roads. And I'll start with a little bit of historical context before we talk about roads themselves and what this moment around 1893 looked like in the United States. This is when the so-called frontier had come to a close, and the promise of abundant lands had not resulted in the kind of economic independence that folks like Thomas Jefferson outlined as justification for things like the Louisiana Purchase, and later politicians justified for war with Mexico. The land grant railroads that Congress had granted charters to before the Civil War and shortly thereafter accelerated the rates of industrialization, of urbanization, and importantly, corporate monopolies. So when we lionize the small businesses along Route 66 or the family farms the road passes by, it is because even in 1893, these forms of making a decent living were falling further and further out of reach for more and more Americans. In many ways, the loss of this Jeffersonian ideal is what Frederick Jackson Turner, probably the most influential American history of all time, remarked upon when he delivered his now famous frontier thesis in Chicago, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Quote, "Wave after wave is rolling westward," he said, "and the real El Dorado is still farther on. But," he added, "the democracy born of free land has its dangers. The frontier has gone, and with it has closed the first period of American history." He, like many others, believed that rugged individuals had given way to industrial corporations. With no more open land, or no more land to open, I should say, by purchase or by conquest, America, it seemed, in 1893 was in crisis. The larger point I hope to show in this talk, by the end of this talk then, is that rural Arizonans saw road building as a strategy to achieve the economic independence promised by folks a generation or two before that was heretofore unfulfilled. For Anglo settlers, this was a large goal, and to a limited but not non-existent extent, hope to extend to others in this coalition of a more powerful state. So keeping that promise in mind, let's briefly return to the image that I had on the title slide. It was taken by Mr. and Mrs. Dana Stearns in the winter of 1916 to 1917, during a road trip from Iowa. In the frame, you see a line of cars waiting for a tow line. Quote, a few days later, their great-granddaughter wrote in her scrapbook of the journey, a very bad storm, she noted, had washed out the bridge near Flagstaff, and they had to pay a whole dollar for being forded across. This is a this is from the AHS Tucson archives. It's a phenomenal photograph collection, and one of many others I'll share through the talk, including this one. So here too, you see grandma sterns crossing the Colorado River between Arizona and Needles, California, on what would become Route 66 in 1926. But in 1917, note just how little public infrastructure existed to support their westward drive. The tourists who set out in that era had no idea what to expect when they left the dirt or the asphalt roads and the brick roads of the East and made their way to the dirt trails that still covered much of the West. Now, this picture is interesting to me as well, and maybe in the Q&A we could get into this, but in 1916, a steel arch bridge opens between Needles and Arizona. I don't know why these tourists didn't cross it, because, as you note in the caption, this barge did not have a good working motor. So if a bridge existed, why not take it? I don't know. Anyway, back to our storyline. Guidebooks for the folks driving at this time who didn't know what to expect offered things like mileage estimates, but rarely on the road itself were there signs to mark the way to Southern California, until the Southern California Automobile Club marked it in 1924, almost a decade after the Sterns made their trip west. And the maps that these highway groups, like the one here in this caption, or the one here in this slide show, depicted what locals would call, quote, paper roads. People got lost trying to find where the map actually represented a dirt path. Those highways the map showed were far more speculative than they were concrete. So before there was this freedom of the open road that we now think about, people had to make that road. And they had to make a road that could rival the nation's privately owned railroads, which were already moving vast numbers of people, millions of people, every year across the continent. A comprehensive history of this, fortunately for my job security, hasn't been written, at least for Route 66. There are, though, lots of exciting vignettes. The episodes that I mentioned, the races, the cutoffs, and the ports of entry. You may even be familiar with some of these, probably the famed Santa Fe cutoff in the popular histories, but these are usually treated as such, episodes that stand out either as visionary or visionary, as would be the case with the automobile races, or aberrations, as with the controversial ports of entry in the Great Depression, which aren't quite as common in our popular memories anymore. In the 1980s, preservationists did note that this was one of the more unfortunate moments in Route 66 history. But anyway, these kinds of vignettes often get used in a way that naturalizes the road, as if it was always there or destined to be there. It's a descriptive way that defines the road by what happens along it, and that really predicts its becoming into existence. But these approaches don't explain how that thing, Route 66, actually came into being. And that was a struggle. In 1916, in 1926, in 1936, people were just figuring out what a road could do for their well-being. And, like a lot of us today, their vision of a better future was based upon a dissatisfaction with the past. We take for granted the historical politics of figuring out what roads could do for economic development. Yet the outcome of those policy choices was indeed profound. Roads now stitch together almost every single town in America, and during the period of the building boom, the nation's economy did get stronger. These are not necessarily causal, but it's an association we make. Route 66 today represents a time chiefly between World War II and the 1960s, when upward mobility in the United States was at an all-time high. All this to say, on a road shrouded in myth, it is still based on truth. Those Okies and Arkies generally did better after moving west along Steinbeck's Mother Road, that road of flight during the 1930s Dust Bowl. African Americans, too, escaped the Jim Crow South, which included the sundown towns in Oklahoma and Missouri, though with a lot of help from Green Books, because even out west, not all motels and restaurants were open to people of color. Here in Arizona and also New Mexico, working class Hispanic families not only earned decent living wages and union contracts, many won elections and held political office, including Dennis Chavez in New Mexico, who starts by boosting roads and a kind of early civil rights movement to win job contracts for Hispanic families during the Depression. These are all inspiring and important stories of how the road is associated with upward mobility. And of course, the biggest story of all is probably that post-war boom, where after the Second World War, nurses and soldiers from the factory towns in New Jersey, Ohio, and the like found new middle-class opportunities in the burgeoning Sunbelt suburbs of Southern California, Albuquerque, and Phoenix. The latter, I know, Phoenix isn't on Route 66, but Route 66 was one of the roads many folks took to get to all three of these cities. It was, as Frank Lloyd Wright said at the time, the giant chute down which everything loose in this country was flowing west. Now, for purposes of this talk, we're not concerned with how millions of Americans forged better lives traveling along the Mother Road. That is the well-worn adage. We're interested in asking why Route 66 and the early roads like it came to exist in the first place. It's an essential origin story. Those later experiences comprise the collective memories of a widely, though not yet equally achievable shot at the American dream. In places like Kingman and Holbrook, pictured here, this was especially true for the men and women who ran the iconic mom and pop shops, the diners, the motels, a dream that policymakers and preservationists today are still struggling to make possible going into our 21st century, though I guess we're now a quarter of our way through it. I might return to this American dream lost and found at the close of the talk if we have time. But let's focus on the future that these motel owners imagined when they first started boosting a coast-to-coast highway in the early 20th century and took a gamble to build these places before traffic was what it would become in the post-war. I'll argue in my larger project and as a kind of thread through this talk that the political will to build Route 66 came from deep-seated fears of economic decline in the rural West. Between 1893 and 1938, Main Street economies worsened even as populations doubled in some towns. The post-war prosperity, brief as it was, came from this booster class before the war, those owning small businesses, but not particularly rich, who were the loudest proponents of federal road aid, and they were the folks who originally argued for good roads everywhere. During this period, 1893 through 1938, they created the blueprint that Washington used to recover from the Great Depression nationwide, and their road building legislation is still, to this day, used by our government to jumpstart the national economy when things go south. Now, let's get into the reasons why rural Arizonans, the people who built the roads rather than the tourists who followed them, believed these roads would make their lives better. So, to make sense of what a tattered Jeffersonian ideal of working the land could look like 100 years out after the Declaration of Independence, just mentioning it because it's the theme of our talk, I still think we ought to return to the railroad towns of northern Arizona during the waning days of territorial status. And we need to look here at the region's first Route 66 booster. He was an Indian trader and former company man for the Santa Fe Railroad. This is Clinton N. Cotton, who was born April 12, 1859, on a farm in central Ohio. He was a lot like Kit Carson from the frontier generation who came before. Clint's dad died before his boy finished school, and just like Carson, Clint landed an apprenticeship somewhere in Missouri. Clint, too, ran off. Following the Santa Fe by rail rather than by trail, Clint made his way to New Mexico in 1881, where the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad was on a building bonanza for California, along an 1866 congressional land grant containing several million acres in a checkerboard pattern across the Colorado Plateau. It was, I'll add, modeled in the Land Ordinance of 1785, a primary objective of the Jeffersonian faction of the Founding Fathers. Clint, though, Clint, though, had developed just enough skill with a telegraph that he landed a job. Not a great job. The railroad agent sent him to milepost 138.8 west of Albuquerque, and within a few months he was moved 10 miles further to Fort Wingate, outside what is now Gallup. Somehow, he convinced Mary Alice Crane, the daughter of a university professor from his hometown in Ohio, not only to marry him in 1882, but also to move into a one-room boxcar apartment parked beside the train tracks, where she gave birth to their first son. So either for want of work, probably more so than out of boredom, he opened a trading post in partnership with the Juan Lorenzo Hubble 2 years later of the famed Hubble Post in northern Arizona. Clint bought half the interest in that now famous trading post near Fort Defiance and ran the shop while Hubble served as sheriff at St. John's. To grow the business, he did what most entrepreneurs do and borrowed $1,200 from a neighbor, pretty tough interest rate of 7%, and he borrowed another 2 grand from his father-in-law, all to buy sheep, which provided the wool that Navajo weavers wanted in exchange for the blankets he was beginning to export east. It was a big gamble, considering the two traders were operating in Navajo Nation without a license from the United States government. And the gamble really didn't pay off. Quote, in regard to money, he wrote in 1886, I'm way behind. A week later, he added that he was busted as usual. Doing business independently, the two traders learned was quite hard. Nowhere in the rural West had the cash economy taken hold to pay working class laborers, and merchants relied upon government contracts to buy in bulk and relied on patient creditors to make ends meet. For Clint, weavers were among his largest customers in terms of trade volume. The math was complicated. He traded canned coffee for the choicest blankets and bought in bulk above market rate because weavers expected he honor their relationship. This was fraught. Needless to say, with customers who were also in debt, the traders rarely made enough hard money then to pay for the wholesale goods that they had imported ahead of demand. That is, unless they worked out a deal on freight rates. Railroads were kingmakers in this era. In fact, because of his failures, Clint figured out railroad economics faster than most of his competitors. In 1889, he convinced the Oregon City Manufacturing Company to hire him as their agent in Gallup, guaranteeing him a competitive wholesaling pricing. And with that in mind, he also built the biggest warehouse in town, adjacent to the A&P tracks. This move he intended to be more lucrative than a trading post on Navajo Nation. But in 1894, the A&P went into receivership right after its parent company, the Santa Fe Railroad, went bankrupt. With their capital improvements on pause, Clint desperately tried to offload his surplus blankets at a profit in lieu of selling shovels and hoes. So in the wake of this global economic downturn, Clint invented the wholesale catalog for Navajo-made goods. Around 1895 or 1896, he mailed out his first color catalog to major retailing houses back east, including Macy's in Manhattan, Marshall Field's in Chicago, and Wanamaker's, where I live in Philadelphia. And he marketed these blankets as rugs. Really, by chance, middle-class consumers back east picked up on this trend. The rugs went viral, so to speak, because Easterners, like Westerners, were growing disillusioned by the rapid pace of industrialization. Clint, more than his competitors, was able to corner this new market. He did this, one, because he was selling at a volume no competitor could match, so he got much lower rates from the Santa Fe Railroad, which in 1897 fully took over its subsidiary, the A&P. And two, Clint Cotton was able to corner the market because the unexpected popularity of the Santa Fe style meant more tourists to the Southwest. It meant the look was in vogue. Of course, his old friend Hubble maintained a share of the national trade by reserving exceptional blankets for the Fred Harvey chain of hotels. But Clint made even more money and with less notoriety by employing larger numbers of Navajo women as weavers and Navajo men as industrial wage workers, the latter whose wages paid for the dyes that went into the rugs that made the Southwest really were the logo, so to speak, for the region, perhaps even are to this day. The Santa Fe Railroad, though, went deeper into debt after emerging from receivership because its president convinced the board that native landscapes were the one competitive advantage that railroad had over others, with all the others with more freight traffic. The desert, remember, wasn't producing as many crops before the Hoover Dam. So, this meant that the Santa Fe needed smoother tracks for faster trains and a new spur leading directly to the Grand Canyon's south rim, where Mary Coulter designed the Hopi House, where Hopi children were dancing for middle-class tourists by 1905. However, in 1905, it was hard to find track gangs. White workers were no longer willing to work for $1 a day as they did in the 1880s. So, the district superintendent turned to Clint to raise up to 600 Navajo workers. And apparently, this caused quite the stir. The Gallup newspaper concluded that, quote, Navajo Indians have seemingly formed a union, close quote. Clint, by that time, he had also earned a moniker, quote, Goldtooth, in the Navajo language, only partly because of the filling he wore. When a tribal citizen was asked by the press, too, why he was not at work on the route and why his other peers weren't on the route to Williams, that Navajo worker said the pay rate from Clint Cotton was too low. He said, quote, a damn fool worked for that. That summer, Francis Loop, who was head of the U.S. Office of Indian Affairs in Washington, caught wind of this trouble, or some other trouble to that effect, and in July sent an agent to investigate how the trader was, quote, working Indians, close quote. The agent reported back to Loop that Navajo laborers were encouraged to spend their earnings at the commissary owned by Clint rather than being taught to save, as was U.S. government department policy. And Navajo workers were issued tokens for store credit in lieu of cash. Just like the one seen here. I took this off of some sort of website where you can buy the coins. They're tough to come by. And on the backside, you see it's worth $1. This is how Clint paid workers. Again, he had cornered the market because the wages earned could only be spent through his chain of stores. It's a lot like the company's store model that gets so much attention in places like rural Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Pretty standard operating practice, and one that no workers really liked. All of this, made the gold-tooth trader an increasingly unpopular guy. As the mayor of Gallup and a commissioner on the state's regulatory board that oversaw freight rates, even his neighbors and trading partners started to think that Clint had become a political problem. Keep in mind that during the turn of the century, outside a few tourist landmarks, the Southwest looked a lot more like Pittsburgh, hell with the lid off, than it did a land of enchantment or perpetual sunshine. The backlash to his industrial prosperity caught him off guard. Indeed, what we now call the Progressive Era caught a lot of Americans off guard. It was a period of profound political realignments. Remember, Clint was a Lincoln Republican, born from nothing and upwardly mobile. So when he talked about the virtues of hard work, he spoke from personal experience, and he likely meant it, even if it's not the outcome that others were achieving. He boasted the redemptive qualities and the opportunities of getting ahead. At this time, though, it just was not happening. Conditions out west actually got worse. Richard White, a Stanford historian of the West, found in his book Railroaded that per capita income fell in states served by the transcontinental railroads. In places like Holbrook, I found the Santa Fe Railroad stopped paying its property taxes during this period, and even where oil was discovered in the 1910s and 20s, could not always afford to build new branch lines. In 1915, total trackage for railroads in the United States reached its all-time peak. No amount of regulation could force any company to build. This is where the public roads come back into our story. While vacationing at a second home on the Pacific Coast in 1911, Clint met some people in the Automobile Club of Southern California, and they had an idea. They wanted a coast-to-coast highway paid for by taxpayers of the United States government. They were forming two associations. One, the National Highway Association, which would lobby Washington for money to build, and two, the National Old Trail Highway Association, which would focus on organizing towns along the route from Los Angeles to New York. Clint signed on as vice president. There was only one problem. The politicians in Arizona and New Mexico could not make up their minds. Let's look a little closer at this map, this one in color. even though it's about a decade older. This one also from the archive in Arizona. You'll see that on this map, zooming in, there are two spurs on the same highway marked in red. The northerly route goes through Gallup with more towns and follows the railroad, though the railroad's not on the map. And the other is the Springerville route that follows a mountain pass that did not have any tracks. Shopkeepers from both lobbied aggressively for inclusion on a proposed highway, the National Old Trails Road. At their convention hosted at the Grand Canyon in 1915, delegates to the National Old Trails Highway Association, who came from every state on the route, could not decide on the alignment either. In order to win legislation to fund construction, they needed as much public support as possible. Moreover, they needed state support from the state governments too. Arizona politicians preferred Springerville to Gallup because it brought motorists further south, which would make Phoenix and Tucson popular detours on the way to LA. And our old friend Clint preferred his adopted hometown, Gallup, where he, a mini monopolist, was losing electoral support. Rather than picking a side, the conventioners elected to adopt both, and they split the traffic, at least in theory. As you can imagine, neither town was really happy with this compromise, and they hoped to prove their case for only one way west on this road. In the summer of that year, 1915, boosters along the Springerville route staged a race covering over 100 miles. They hoped to show theirs was a faster route than their rivals. And it was pretty convincing. The elevation changes were more modest. It was a fairly straight shot through the plains of San Augustine, and there were no pesky volcanic rocks, really, sharp El Malpai that blew out tires like along the Gallup route. A year later, on the 4th of July, 1916, Clint staged a rematch. Well, this was quite the show. Its winner rolled over home plate, the finish line in the town's ballpark. He did so on two wheels. But the race, after it all shook out, still pretty much proved the case for the Springerville route. One contestant went missing for over a week. They took a wrong turn somewhere around Grants. Another contestant rolled over on the soft soils of the Rio Grande Valley, and another had his tires blow out over the volcanic rock under Mount Taylor. In 1916, also, to underscore this point, Arizona included only the Springerville route on its official state highway map. There was little any one politician from any one town could do. Even with the Federal Aid Road Act signed into Woodrow Wilson in 1960, that same summer, the U.S. government did not dictate which roads got paved. And by 1923 and 1924, when the Southern California Road Association put up trail signs for the National Old Trail, they followed the Springerville route. That's also where they placed the Madonna of the Trail monument that is still there to this day. As many rural folks were figuring out this new government policy, highway races were how they voluntarily determined where those routes should go. Those results, however, were not permanent. Now let's turn our attention to the second major episode, cutoffs. You can see here in this image a line in red and a line in green, pretty typical for New Mexico. The green is the original alignment of the state's preferred Gallup route along the National Old Trail Road. It is officially what became Route 66 in 1926, when the federal government finally stepped in to decide where the routes should go and assigned numbers to named trails. There's also the red line, which runs between Grants, Albuquerque, Moriarty, and Santa Rosa, and then on either side. This in the middle is what got called Hannett's Revenge. It's the shortcut that eventually took Santa Fe off Route 66. But this well-known controversy in Route 66 lore over routing really had its origins in the coast-to-coast battles that were centered on interstate competition between New Mexico and Arizona, with Springerville at the center. You see, Arthur Hannett was a progressive Democrat who rode on the coattails of Woodrow Wilson and ousted Clint Cotton from the mayor's office in Gallup in 1918. He too attended the same Good Roads conventions and was miffed that Springerville got the motorists. In Gallup, a rough and tumble coal town, Few middle-class tourists were yet willing to venture far from the luxurious Fred Harvey Hotel. So Hannett won votes because he promised roads would undermine the autocratic likes of the old guard, kind of targeted dig at his old buddy and friend, uh, Clint. So quickly, Hannett, mayor of Gallup in 1918, was appointed a state highway commissioner, and by 1925 won the governor's office. This was a pretty meteoric rise for a guy from a small town. On his way to the inauguration, Hannett chose to drive rather than take the train, unlike Clint Cotton, who always took the train when he traveled despite being a road booster. And Hannett chose to survey the westernmost cutoff that he had imagined between Grants and Albuquerque, even before Route 66 was designated in 1926. So on the way to the inauguration in 1925, this is the hill he had to climb to get into Santa Fe, and it was particularly onerous. By the time most motorists reached Albuquerque, especially the ones from the east traveling west, the kind of folks people in Gallup and Springerville wanted to attract, they were pretty tired after going over this, and they wanted the fastest way to California. In 1925, that was still Springerville. So during his 2-year tenure as governor, even bigger things were happening in Washington. The U.S. Bureau of Public Roads convened a joint board of state and federal highway officials to determine route numbers for the system of roads, quote, interstate in character, to use the language of the 1921 Federal Highway Act. The government did this in part because infighting among trail associations, like that of Springerville and Gallup, stalled progress on paving the roads that Washington was choosing to fund. From their efforts, this joint board, pre-existing roads got their numbers. Route 66 was made from much, but not all, of the National Old Trails Road. But let's again zoom in. Notice that both the Gallup and Springerville routes of what had been the National Old Trails Highway each got numbered designations. Gallup landed on Route 66 thanks to the New Mexico state engineer who was appointed to the joint board. But in November 1926, when this map was finalized, that number didn't yet mean much to motorists. It was brand new. For most people, landing on an east-west route ending in 0 signified a more important highway. Springerville landed on Route 70, which was not long after amended to be Route 60, the number it holds today. This was the better route. In December 1926, as Hannett was leaving office, he directed the State Highway Department to clear the Moriarty Cutoff, which went on to Santa Rosa, as a shortcut for Route 66 because he no longer had any political capital to lose. It was a blatant attempt at keeping motorists off US Route 60, which ran just a few miles south in eastern New Mexico. He wanted them to instead take 66. In a spring 1927 convention held at Albuquerque, highway boosters also worried that tourists were still routing onto Los Angeles by way of the Springerville route. Quote, "It is in our best interests in both cities to cooperate," said Abraham Zinn. This lawyer had driven to Santa Fe with Hannett for the inauguration 2 years prior, and he said what all 150 people in the room understood. They were in Albuquerque, and it was mostly Albuquerque and Gallup folks. So he said, quote, "We in Gallup are not your competitors," to the Albuquerque folks. Quote, "Phoenix and El Paso are." The boosters, who had once advocated for good roads everywhere to get federal aid, were starting to see this somewhat universal government program now as a problem. While aid on many routes leveled the playing field, competition had not gone away. Nor did the trail associations. Although the chief of the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads saw organizations like the National Old Trails Highway Association as an impediment that made paving roads tougher, boosters didn't want to give up their competitive edge. In February 1927, Arizona was among the 3 states that refused to send delegates to the first meeting of the U.S. Highway 66 Association held in Springfield, Missouri. In attendance, however, were the Albuquerque businessmen who shared responsibility for the cutoff. Indeed, at that first meeting, The cutoffs were among their main talking points, and the press widely reported on an Albuquerque representative as saying, quote, "We want to save 74 miles passing through a rerouting of the road from Santa Rosa to Albuquerque." This organization that was intended to shape competition, this organization, in its founding in 1927, was intended to shape the competition between Route 66 and Route 60. They boosted what would become the Mother Road and fought against the better number that went south from Springerville onto Phoenix and into Los Angeles. Or, I guess, San Diego, sorry. Now, this is where our third episode, and I'll keep this one brief, the ports of entry come into play. Today, we do not stop on the road when we cross state lines, but this started to change around 1934 when the Kansas legislature passed the nation's first ports of entry law. Well, they used the explosion of hobos and drifters during the Great Depression as justification. The Santa Fe Railroad, which controlled the Kansas state legislature, lobbied for its passage. Truck traffic and bus traffic had eroded their monopoly over interstate travel. The roads, railway executives argued, needed to be regulated to ensure fair competition. Wildcat buses didn't pay taxes. Carpooling, essentially what poor travelers were doing, cost a lot less than train fare. And other states followed Kansas, including New Mexico and Arizona. As you can see in this 1935 spreadsheet from New Mexico, officials allocated several $1,000s to construct border checkpoints at each place where a public road crossed state lines. All motorists were expected to stop. On this map, which I created a few years ago, you can see 20 little red dots ringing New Mexico. Also mapped are Route 60 and Route 66. In 1935, when the state passed its port of entry law, Clyde Tingley was governor. As an old friend of Hannett and former state highway maintenance manager, he drew the blueprints for the cutoffs. Now, almost a decade later, he personally dictated the order in which these ports would be opened. The pilot port was on Route 60, near Clovis, New Mexico. This was probably deliberate, though Tingley never said it. But it was controversial. Folks in Clovis were already unnerved that the state had nearly finished paving in asphalt both Route 66 and parts of the cutoffs. So the merchants along Route 60 felt the ports of entry in Clovis unfairly inconvenienced the motorists they also sought. Under this port of entry law, all passengers had to prove they were related in order to qualify for an exemption from wildcat bus taxes, among a long list of stipulations. If a uniformed guard suspected you paid a buddy a cent for gas while bumming a ride, the driver could be charged with running an illegal bus. At times, it felt like a shakedown. It was probably toughest for Okies and Arkies, but they weren't always turned away. A side note, I found, and they're mapped on this as the little teepee tents. Side note, state officials in New Mexico opened work camps before Roosevelt's WPA, where they paid Dust Bowl migrants to build the state roads, including 66. Now, while I found very little from the Okies' perspective, the archives in Santa Fe are littered with complaint letters from middle-class tourists crossing state lines. New Mexico, though, was not alone. The situation was so bad that the Chicago Tribune ran a series of political cartoons about these ports of entry. Here is the worst. Depicted as Native Americans are the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and California shooting arrows at a white couple raising a white flag. Under it are listed identification papers, birth certificate, tax receipt, bill of sale, naturalization papers, marriage license, tax refund, and tax profit. What boosters on Route 66 did? Those in favor of Route 60 in Arizona also did the same. For the cash-carrying tourists, this was miserable. For the Dust Bowl refugees, I'd have to imagine it was even worse. But after news made its way back east, all three states went on PR blitzes to salvage their image. New Mexico paid for advertisements in every major American magazine, and in Arizona, the state hired Barry Goldwater, then running his family's department store empire, to rebrand the checkpoints as ports of welcome. These have become our modern-day welcome centers. So, now that time has run short, what's the moral of these three stories taken together? The highway boosters, who started out in search of a solution to railway monopolies, turned into the political insiders they had once loathed. In 1938, the Mother Road became the first fully paved highway from east to west, and it monopolized road traffic in northern Arizona. Springerville, you can see on this Arizona highways map, barely registered traffic compared to 66, with 66 matched only in part by the southerly connection along what was the Lee Highway from El Paso toward Phoenix. In fact, Route 66 at this time had the second highest traffic counts among all U.S. highways by the decade's end, beat only by US 1 down the Atlantic coast. Today, we recognize Route 66 as the world's most famous highway because it transformed rough and tumble and downwardly mobile railroad towns into automobile boom towns, making the promise of owning a small business possible for those so lucky to land on a route. This is the mystique that Route 66 still enjoys, and a large part of what makes Route 66 mythic. Route 66's success depended on outcompeting the folks in Springerville and countless other littler places like it. Between 1893 and 1938, countless people living along country roads we've never heard about dreamt that their roads would someday be the Mother Road. So now how about some Q&A, now that I talked a lot?
Thank you so much, Jake. Would you mind closing your screen share?
Of course, let me find that
Thank you.
button.
Easier said than done, right? No, I
It,
think that's so fascinating, right? And when you think about like roads or trails, it seems like, okay, people want to go, people are here and they want to go here. Like, let's connect the dots. But of course, it is much more complicated than that, but not just because of the geographical landscape, but because of the politics. And I think kind of going all the way back to, Jeffersonian land ordinances is so important for understanding why they're so, why this is such a deeply felt, um, why they're so passions get so inflamed with some of these things. So as we're waiting for some questions to come in, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about kind of how you became interested in this topic. Of course, you have some practical career experience, but how did you become interested in Route 66? And as you're doing your research, what kind of surprised you?
well, Route 66 in itself surprised me. I moved to Albuquerque in 2015 from Pittsburgh, and living just a couple of blocks off the Mother Road, I felt was so confusing. One, because at the time I was studying urban geography and urban planning, and back east, all the rage was density and transit-oriented design. And while I was in Albuquerque at that time, it's when they built that still quite unpopular bus line down the center of Route 66, the ART project. And And those in favor said it would be good for business. Those who said it eroded the historical kind of essence of Route 66 said it would be bad for business. In the end, it looks like it's been pretty bad for the legacy businesses. But that politics didn't gel with what I had expected to find coming from the East, where density and new urbanism was all the rage. And planners didn't really have the answer, which I learned even more working in planning, is you can't measure traffic counts and store revenues and figure out why something like 66 is sacrosanct to folks who have been long invested along the road. History was the method I found best for figuring out what that much longer meaning is. So that's why I went back to grad school.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about, all all people want their road to be the mother road. I mean, I think that is so important. And Route 66, still has like a very nostalgic kind of American quality to it. So we kind of, stopped in the early part of the 20th century. Would you mind kind of projecting into maybe later phases of Route 66?
Sure, some of the tensions that I'm trying to tease out at the end of this talk are what lead to the association, the US Highway 66 Association's undoing by the 1960s and 1979, I think, is when it finally disbands. Uh, One of the big myths in Route 66 lore is that the US Highway 66 Association was among the vanguard that protested the interstates. The boosters in the 50s and 60s counted among the loudest advocates for Eisenhower to pass that bill. And in the construction of those interstates, it started to pull the coalition apart. Uh, I didn't find this so much in the Tucson archives, but when I was at Northern Arizona University last summer, they have just the most impressive Chamber of Commerce records I've ever encountered for Flagstaff. And through the 60s and 70s, every single town in Arizona, every little town in Arizona, not every single town, but from southern Arizona to northern Arizona was really confused what an interstate was going to do, and they were writing to each other to figure out, do we want the interstate or not? And Flagstaff's Chamber of Commerce was an outlier that was deeply in favor of building the interstate because it would alleviate traffic, truck traffic, and make it easier for tourists to drive on the road. And bigger towns generally liked this. Albuquerque, for example, was not really an opponent to the interstates. It was the smaller towns whose fates were more uncertain as cars go faster. And because smaller towns and the bigger cities had very likely different fates with the interstates, the membership role of the US Highway 66 Association started to shrink. And the organization could not represent the plurality of interests within it because those fates had become so divergent. Uh, Even though the old guard boosters within the or within the Highway 66 Association really wanted to see continued technological progress to outcompete other routes. Uh, so the second half is really how this powerful coalition starts to unravel. But it's not as simple as just protesting the interstates. I think that's the main contribution I'm trying to make in the second half.
For sure. I find it so fascinating as a historian of Arizona. There are these kind of moments that are so profound and have such a profound impact on Arizona's history. But when you sit down and you look at the time, you go, wow, that was 6 months. Why is this 6 months like so incredibly impactful 150 years later? And I think Route 66 is one of those things where it's like, I mean, yeah, the route is, of course, the route is still there, and it's still such an important part of our identity as Arizonans, as Westerners, as Americans, and all that stuff. But it's at its height for maybe, I don't know, 30, 40 years. And then because of the interstate changes to the interstate system, kind of starts to become less of a convenient path. So one of these questions that we've got from the audience, I think is a really interesting one. And it's something we kind of chit-chatted a little bit before this session. And that's some of the like experienced logistics of driving on Route 66. So this question is explicitly about speed traps. But I think that it kind of teases out a larger question about car culture, about what the experience of actually driving long distances in this time would be like, and then kind of law enforcement. And how is law enforcement kind of keeping up with car culture and technology?
Yeah, the speed traps, these show up a lot in complaint letters to chambers of commerce, which are not the democratically elected, you know, borough managers or city managers, but motorists really did not like getting a ticket if they drove through somewhere like Holbrook. And were they deliberately, if you read those records, Chamber of Commerce representatives and even elected officials would deny ever having a speed trap. And they would say this is just routine safety measures. I think there's two things at play. One, people were just driving too fast, and congestion on Route 66 in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s was at a crisis point. So you have lots of people getting out their cars to shop on traditional main streets, and you have people making illegal passing movements. That's just bad. And engineers in the State Department knew this. Sometimes even merchants would post unregulation speed limit signs that vexed the engineers trying to slow down people. One, for safety, two, so people would slow down, look at the sign, and go buy something. Uh, but the speed traps, whether they were a trap or not, there was a deliberate effort to slow people down, but it was for many different reasons. Merchants to slow down to buy stuff, elected officials because traffic deaths actually meant people would take an alternative route, and engineers who knew the road wasn't spec to handle anything at that speed. The cops, though, are on the front line and take the brunt of blame, which I actually think is a little unfair. It's more complicated, but historians always say things are complicated.
Yeah, it's the go-to turn of phrase, right? So I had kind of quipped earlier at this Q&A that, oh, you have these places that people want to go, connect a line from point A to point B and get people there. Route 66 kind of runs through some of the most beautiful landscapes of the area, but the one that I think kind of gets teased out as especially a destination in early Arizona car culture is kind of the Grand Canyon. So can you talk a little bit about the Grand Canyon and its relationship with the route, if there is one?
The Grand Canyon is the crown jewel of Route 66 boosting efforts because the Grand Canyon is the vogue tourist destination for the first 30, 40 years of the 20th century. I guess even to this day, it's a premier national park. And and for boosters, winning Grand Canyon traffic away from the railroad was pretty deeply tied to their anti-monopoly politics, uh, which were way more real back then than they are today. But if you were a merchant in, say, Winslow is going to be a bad example because that's a late Harvey house. So I'm going to lean on Gallup, which I know isn't Arizona. But if you were a tourist from the east thinking about going to see the Grand Canyon and you traveled by train, you were staying in Fred Harvey houses and eating at Fred Harvey restaurants. So when you stop in Gallup, you're never leaving the train station. When you stop in Williams, you're never leaving the train station. Uh, you are staying within the Santa Fe system. Santa Fe owns the Fred Harvey Company. They keep the Fred Harvey name because he sounds like an independent proprietor, but it is a part of a corporate subsidiary, really first chain in the United States. So for people owning cafes and mom and pop shops in Gallup, in Winslow, in Holbrook, in Williams, getting people to travel by car rather than train means that people will stop in your cafe. Uh, And so they're trying to win the traffic to the Grand Canyon. They brand as the Grand Canyon route before they brand as the Will Rogers Highway. And it is really to try and win traffic over. By 19, I think it's 1933, your archive has these papers. I think it's in one of the highway, actually, I think it's in one of the Arizona Highways copies, which are all digitized. Uh, Grand Canyon car traffic bests railroad traffic by by like 1933. And that's at the point where a lot of the Santa Fe debts to build all the Grand Canyon resorts and the new tracks, that's when those debts are coming due. Um, so I think I hope that answers the question. The
Yeah,
Grand,
no, totally. And it's a good segue into my kind of last wrap up question. Of course, we are all patiently waiting for your dissertation and future manuscript of your work. But in the meantime, what would you recommend as some secondary sources and perhaps even some primary sources for really understanding, particularly the southwestern leg of Route 66?
ooh, there's a book by Erica Busamek called Indian Maid. And she covers 1868, right around when Navajo Nation settles its treaty with the federal government, through the 1940s. And it's about how Navajo culture is commodified, both by folks like Cotton and Hubble, but then also by Navajo weavers themselves as a strategy to earn wages as like the sheep making economy is not working. And so the railroad and the road are all essential to this, but are not the topic of her book per se. But it's about the making of the Southwest as a cultural destination, and she does it in a really smart way, where you see all the different pluralities of people who are negotiating what it means to turn the Southwest into a tourist destination. That's book number one. Uh, I think Richard White's book Railroaded is just a gem. Uh, if you want to understand the politics that Americans loathed at the turn of the century. And then, ooh, Arizona, or especially for Arizona, Andrew Needham's book Power Lines is essential reading. He's a good social historian who takes on technology, which can be a dry topic, but you don't get a booming Southwest that can support tourist traffic and major industrial development without harnessing electricity. And that comes from coal and that comes from water. And I mean, it's not 66, but it is a study of the kind of political work it takes to build the infrastructure that makes a city like Phoenix today with almost 2 million people possible in a very arid environment. So I don't know, those would be my three.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Jake, for joining us today. Thank you all in the audience for attending today's program. And we hope that you have a really great rest of your afternoon. Take care, y'all. Bye.
Thanks so much, all.